Again, with a flexible lead this time. Andres, good morning. I see a number of faces who were here yesterday. That's wonderful that you've given us your weekend. Weekends are very precious times. There are a number of things that you should know about yesterday, and in general to know what time it is, aside from the fact that it's 10 minutes late. And Margaret Prescod from Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike will be cluing you in. When she has spoken, we will then move on to the structure of the panels and some plans that were arrived at yesterday, which must be firmed up today. I'm Selma, by the way. Margaret Prescod.
Good morning. Good to see you. See some of you who were here yesterday, and some new faces who are here today. And it's such a pleasure and delight to be able to have this conference in the brand new Crossroads Women's Center.
Yes.
And congratulations to all who worked to make it possible. I know a number, for those of you who were not here yesterday, what I wanted to do was to just give you some sense of what you missed. The panels were just fantastic yesterday. And to bring you up to scratch and then talk just briefly about where we have reached as a campaign, which means where we have reached as a movement generally. There were a number of panels yesterday. I won't try.
Okay, sorry about that.
Maybe should I hold it, or I'm going to do a different stand?
Take your stand.
That's right. Brilliant yesterday, sex, race, and class. What are the terms of unity? But throughout the day, you'll be hearing from Selma. And for those of you who do not yet have your copy of Sex, Race, and Class, A Perspective of Winning, a selection of writings, 1952 to 2011. It's a must read. The actor and activist Danny Glover, who is here, has told me that he started reading it and he thinks it's wonderful. I think he's here in the audience somewhere. But that was the term, wasn't it wonderful? All righty. Panel one discussed fighting for survival and welfare, South and North, the unrecognized movement of mothers and other carers. And one of the things that Selma underscored, and it's absolutely true in thinking back about what happened yesterday, is that a number of the former colonies are here, and spoke out yesterday. China, we heard from China yesterday, we heard from India, we heard from Guyana, we heard from Ireland, key in the central struggle against colonialism. Also, of course, Haiti, we heard from Haiti yesterday, and from the US and the UK. And in terms of the survival and welfare, South and North, we heard on both sides of the Atlantic, we heard from the United States about the fight that women had made for welfare, for a little money to be able to have the right to raise our own children, and how that money became under attack. It took them a few decades to actually just undermine it and take it away as a right entirely. And we've been focusing on what were the forces that we worked with in our specific struggles, but also who was the opposition. And certainly in the United States, one very quick example that was given was back in 1977 at the first U.S. mandated conference for women that was held, mandated by the U.S. Congress. There was a fight on welfare because the administration were proposing a form of workfare, which I understand is what they're proposing now for the UK. And we had to take a stand at that women's conference against workfare. And who we were up against the feminist bloc, who were basically for jobs outside the home as their strategy for liberation. In that specific conference, I mean, there are always the usual suspects of politicians, etc. But in that particular conference, that's what we were up against. We were able to get through by forming a coalition, and by us meaning the Wages for Housework campaign 40 years anniversary back in 1977, organized a coalition that included women who were in the leadership of the National Welfare Rights Organization in the United States. These were women who not only said that raising children is work and we have earned that money from the government, but they also opposed the war and said we're not sending our children to fight any goddamn war, in Vietnam. And there's some wonderful photos that reflect that struggle. There were women who also went down to welfare offices doing civil disobedience, demanding money for clothing so that their children would be able to go to school. So there was a coalition of that particular group with the Wages for Housework campaign. And for those of us in the Wages for Housework campaign on both sides of the Atlantic, our movement really came out of the welfare rights movement, and Selma spoke brilliantly about that in the tour in the United States. So it was a natural coming together, and we weren't allowed to carry banners into the hall because it was an official government conference. I was one of a delegation representing New York State, so we would wear these aprons that said every mother is a working mother. And the international was important because on the other side of the phone, there weren't fax machines or computers then, but there was Selma at the other end of the phone. So, and Every Mother is a Working Mother Network, we realized that the New York State delegation was sitting, it was going in alphabetical order. We were sitting right in front of the Mississippi delegation, okay? Mississippi, the South, Jim Crow, racism, and all of that kind of stuff, conservatism. And after a while, a few of the women came up and said, I just love your Every Mother's a Working Mother apron. And we also had some buttons, right? And we started chatting them up about it. By the time the vote on our resolution came to the floor, which not only opposed workfare, which not only completely threw out what the President and Congress were proposing, but we rewrote it entirely. And in it, we said that women should have the dignity of welfare being called a wage. This was 1977, okay? And when that came to the floor, who stood up to vote for it was the Mississippi delegation. People today that likely would be part of the Tea Party, you know what I'm saying? That was the kind of coming together of Black and Puerto Rican and Native American women and women from the South who just love Every Mother's a Working Mother. Okay? They just lived it. So that was one example. Now, after that particular victory, it took a decade or more for them to really bring in workfare and to get rid of welfare as a right and make it into what people are calling slave fare, where you have to go get a job outside of the home for either no wage at all or very low wage. And that is what's being implemented now in the UK, and Kay spoke about that and the struggle of single mother self-defense. So you missed quite a lot yesterday in describing that particular struggle. We also heard about breastfeeding and the attack on breastfeeding by the multinational corporations that have a lot to gain by women not breastfeeding. how healthy breastfeeding is and how much research. Solvit Francis did a brilliant job, how much research they did trying to, they've never been able to find research that said breastfeeding is not good for children, okay? So the struggle around breastfeeding was also discussed, and now on caregiving work, another woman from Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike in the United States that made a struggle to get paid by the state to help take care of her mom in her mom's last days, and won that fight. She was paid as a relative caregiver to be able to care for her mom, and her mom just got the best care that she could get in the final days of her life, and we heard about that fight. A nurse, Sydney Ross Risden from Los Angeles, who's been an RN and a long time fighter in the Wages for Housework campaign, I think from the word go, works as a nurse, as a mom and a grandmother, and talked about the brutality in the hospitals against the patients, how patient care and healing really isn't the priority. But who hold a lot of sway are the pharmaceutical companies, the people who are ready to make money off of us being ill, but also nurses who go into the profession, many of whom go into the profession because they really want to help people, but are so overworked that they can't, they really can't manage, and also have to do a lot of bureaucratic stuff these days. You're spending time doing that, really a first-class presentation. On that panel. I was kind of in and out doing a few other things, so I don't want to leave anything out. We also heard from Guyana on that panel, and who talked about, and it was interesting because there were some women from Norway in the room, and they also talked about Norway funding some projects that are supposed to be helping save the planet in Guyana, that in fact we're doing just the opposite. And the women from Guyana were asking, could the women from Norway do anything to pressure their governments, to stop that kind of exploitation. So the other panel that we heard from yesterday on asylum, immigration, and other struggles against poverty, ecological devastation, military occupation, and war. Rhea Dole from Haiti is here. We heard from Rhea. There are recordings of what happened yesterday. There are videos of what happened yesterday. I can't possibly spend the time going into the detail of all of what was said, but Rhea spoke very movingly about the earthquake and what happened and the impact of, and in fact a running theme in talking about these natural disasters that Claire from Invisible spoke about in relation to Bhopal, Manju from India spoke about in relation to drought, in relation to the earthquake. A lot of these are so-called natural disasters, but it was also how a natural disaster becomes a man-made disaster because of the lack of accountability and the fact of these kinds of policies where the caring of people and the environment is not the priority, but actually the opposite. The opposite is, and that certainly was a theme that ran through it. Ray also spoke about the impact of the UN occupation. We had a really successful event, fundraiser for Haiti last night, and we have a little update in terms of the money that we raised.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, maybe I should say that right now.
Please.
We have a donor that you have known for a very long time. A little guessing game here, that you actually mentioned her name when you drafted Sex, Race, and Class, beginning with an A. Althea, who handed an envelope this morning with $1,000 US. from yesterday. Really wanted to acknowledge that. But somebody was talking about UN peacekeeping forces. You know, you always hear about peacekeeping forces. These are occupying forces, okay? Just forget the peacekeeping business. So Rhea spoke about the impact of the UN occupation in Haiti. Maggie, brilliantly on the Irish famine, again, a disaster that was also man-made. I mean, a so-called natural disaster was man-made when people were landless, how they had no recourse when the famine came, the kind of forced starvation and the forced immigration as a result. Shauna from Oakland, California, on the fight for against tar sands, which is the dirtiest way to extract oil from the earth. On indigenous lands and Canada and wanting to pipe that across the United States and you know, which would totally mess up aquifers, etc. Shauna spoke about that, but she also spoke about this thing now that came out of Bolivia, where they have the first indigenous president, about the rights of Mother Earth, where now you can have a legal case. You could go and make a lawsuit on behalf of a tree, or on behalf of a river, okay, on behalf of animals under threat, the rights of Mother Earth. Isn't that fantastic? And the women in Guyana and other places were immediately interested, you know, in that. In Guyana, a key thing, because it gets really so much of the heart of what we're discussing at this conference in relation to the flood. They talked about how Guyana had been divided racially among Afro women, women of East Asian descent, Indo women, they call there, and Amerindian women, who are the indigenous women, and how Red Thread did the work of bringing the women together. When the flood happened, you know, they were able to bring women together and demand and hold the government accountable. You see, it was another natural disaster, but it was also man-made because of the infrastructure that wasn't there, the aid that wasn't there, and how they managed to do it. They did a time use survey from the women from those different racial groups to find out what the women actually spent their time doing and saw how much they had in common. And one of the points Selma made in her presentation yesterday morning is how we can work with people on the basis of what we agree on, but not compromising our principles. You see, we get a little confused on that one, right? Okay, so, and certainly in Guyana, they've done this remarkable work and bringing that information to the conference. Claire from Invisible, based here in the UK, talked about the Bhopal disaster, about ATOS, a charity that is, I understand, a sponsor of the Olympics, and instrumental in implementing workfare here in the UK, welfare reform here in the UK, which is shameful, and also Dow Chemical. Everybody knew how nasty they were and are, especially after Bhopal, and they're now involved in sponsoring the Olympics as well. And of course, Nikki Adams from Legal Action for Women, the English Collective of Prostitutes, really brought it all home, because she talked about the ways in which we have organized and how we, a lot of people say we're really radical, but that we're ready to confront authority and we're ready to drive an issue to the end. You know what I'm saying? We're not going to try and give up, but to drive it to the end, and that not many are ready to do that, and that we do start with the grassroots, how we reject separatism and we make the connections between the issues. Really a fantastic presentation there by Nikki, and making the connection also too with the riots that happened in the UK last summer, being and the breakthrough that happened in the press, with people having a chance to say why and cutting through some of the scabbing of bad parenting and all of that, and how in a way it made the way also for the Occupy movement. And I don't know how many of the people in Occupy are really making those kinds of connections. So a lot happened yesterday. We showed that we are a truly multiracial network. The sister from China who spoke from a family living on a farm, and how they're under threat by proposals from the government for development and the impact that has on other people. And of course, last night was the Haiti event, and I really won't take time to say more about that, but just a couple of things in terms of where
the room was packed.
yeah, the room was packed. And there were some people who were here today, but also an entirely different crowd in a way. And you know, that is something I noticed actually, because I've been here now 3 events, the opening, another crowd, right? You know, the conference yesterday, the Haiti event. I must say, Selma, if everybody that came to each of those 3 events showed up, we probably would, you know, come to the street outside. We need a new center. Anybody ready to fundraise for that? Right? Okay. We would have already outgrown ourselves. But really, I wanted to just, you know, wrap up a report in terms of where we have reached by talking a bit about the impact of Selma's tour in the U.S. and the anthology. Some of what you heard in the report yesterday, you heard that now in the U.S. presidential election of all places, and you might have seen Selma's brilliant article that was in The Guardian last week on it, some woman who is a Democrat, meaning from the Democratic Party, a pundit, made a comment about the wife of Mitt Romney, who is the Republican conservative candidate, that she hadn't worked a day in her life. Then she came back and she said, well, I've raised 5 sons. She never mentioned that she's a multi-millionaire, if not billionaire, so she likely had a full staff, right? And then her children came and loved their mother, as Selma put it, so much that they lied and got on television and said, oh no, we had no staff. Mom did everything. Well, you believe that, you believe anything. But a whole debate busted out then in the United States on what? On valuing the work of mothers. Okay, so President Obama had to weigh in and said it's the toughest job in the world. That means it's tougher than being president of the United States. He talked about the work of his mother. He talked about Michelle and raising their children. Then Mitt Romney, not to be outdone, you know, stood in front of the press, put his arm around his wife and said, every mom is a working mom. Does that sound familiar to y'all? Okay, and so, and then one of the, not a pundit, a host, television host on a major television station that used to work on the Hill in Washington, D.C. as the chief of staff for Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who is known as an architect around welfare and welfare reform. Back in the late 1970s, when they were trying to get rid of welfare reform, a few of us went in there, as we usually do, you know, not like the advocates and the NGOs. We're going to lobby. So we went in the Senate Finance Committee and just stood up and objected to the fact that welfare mothers and those being impacted weren't allowed to testify. So it was kind of like a civil disobedience action. We didn't know if we would be arrested. We were allowed to testify. Daniel Moynihan was in the chair, Senator Moynihan. Leaving, and we gave our spiel. Every mother's a working mother, the Houston Resolution, welfare, the whole thing. When I was leaving that, the same guy who's now on television said to me, what you said will never be accepted by mainstream America. He's now hosting a show where the presidential candidate, the President of the United States, Congress people, and more are now discussing a bill that has been introduced in Congress called the Work Act that Selma and others spoke about yesterday, that for the first time that we know of in U.S. history says being a mother is work. And that low-income mothers should have the same option that Ann Romney had to raise her own children, okay? 40 years. 40 years. And this is where we are right now. This is the level of the debate. And it has taken the country by storm. A lot of the feminists, they're kind of shell-shocked. You know, the ones that have opposed us. You know, the ones who witch hunted us back in the day, and I understand there's still some of them lurking around the place. What's your problem? You know what I'm saying? They're talking about this is the most natural thing in the world, but as you said somewhere, like Topsy, it didn't just happen.
Didn't just grow.
Didn't just grow. Okay, Selma wrote A Woman's Place back in 1952. It's a brilliant piece. It's one of the pieces, A Woman's Place in Sex, Race, and Class, that got me to this movement. And I've been there, ever since. So then, interestingly enough, right before this whole debate breaks out, guess what's launched in the United States? The anthology, Sex, Race, and Class, with, A Woman's Place and the whole analysis in it, taking, the Selma spoke, Phoebe, Phoebe was there, and Phoebe, fantastic, we have to acknowledge Phoebe's work in pulling the tour together. It was just an amazing job. Phoebe Jones-Schellenberg from Philadelphia. Where's Phoebe? There she is in the back. Okay, the tour covered 10 cities from the East Coast to the West Coast in 30 days. Over 12 media interviews, a number of them major media interviews, 31 talks, and one of the events in LA, I said, Selma James, who's 82 years old, Selma pops up and says, 81! I beg your pardon. I'm sorry, Selma. 31 talks, right? Occupies bookstores, universities, community groups, and countless meetings. And those 31 talks were not the same. You know how sometimes you see a politician on, Obama or equivalent over here, and they kind of give the same speech. We're on a speaking tour, right? 12 states, and all 12 states, they give the same damn speech. Well, that was not the case here. It was 30. These were quite different speeches, and it had quite an impact. I'll give an example that I gotta wrap up. Part of the work I do is in the Pacifica Radio Network, which is an alternative radio network in the United States, non-commercial, based in 5 cities, 100 affiliate stations, etc. The flagship show on Pacifica is a show called Democracy Now! That is not only was given birth by Pacifica, but is now heard on over 700 radio and alternative networks in the United States, and is well respected around the world. Now, Amy Goodman, who had met Selma in Haiti when President Aristide came back, and kind of was like, what is this all women count? Do you remember that? She asked you? Sort of had a little bit of an out. Anyway, she saw the book. Selma went in and did an interview on Democracy Now!, just blew them away. The whole staff, Democracy Now!, left what they were doing to come to hear what Selma had to say. That's a breakthrough in the United States, because it means that the kind of liberal left, the ones who are in love with Amy and Democracy Now!, etc., there's a whole other credibility. And then there was a battle for Selma on the other Pacifica networks. And in fact, the show that I do, Sojourner Truth, we were the last ones to air the interview with Selma. But on all of the major stations, there were in-depth interview. And for in the Los Angeles area, for our 8 o'clock audience, Uprising, somebody wrote the host and said, this is the best show, Sonali, you have ever done. Right, so but that just gives you some sense of the impact that the book has had everywhere and in every city. Angela Davis showed up to hear Selma. I don't know if people remember Selma. Angela had done a little slamming, or maybe not so little, of the wages for housework in a book. After Selma wrote Sex, Race, and Class, she wrote something called Race, Sex, and Class, was it? Something like that. Anyway, she showed up, brought her class, wanted to pose for pictures with Selma, and wanted Selma to sign her book, and told Selma, well, I've changed my mind about wages for housework. Elaine Brown, one of the women leaders of the Black Panther Party, one of the few women leaders, came, and Selma and Nikki had been in touch with her about work around the Georgia prisoners' strike, and they've done so much work around with me and the prisoners' strike. We'll talk about that later, and we'll hear Elaine Brown's letter also showed up and was duly impressed. So something has shifted. It took 40 years. Something has shifted. I must end, but we know what has shifted. We feel that the Occupy movement, we'll hear more about the Occupy movement, it's shaken things up. not only in this country but around the world, and we'll be discussing that a bit more. And in a way, we feel the Occupy movement also had something to do with this debate that I just mentioned that's happening now in the United States about the work of mothers. So today we're going to be focusing more on where we are, more on what our next steps will be. And it's been a tremendous ride, Selma, over all of these years to be here and to work with you and to others in this room to build this global, international network. And our time is definitely now. Thank you very much.